The Haunting of Thornwick House. The wind howled as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the old manor house. It stood at the edge of town, where no one dared go after sunset. The locals avoided it like a plague, spinning tales of strange happenings that plagued its halls. Whispers of voices in empty rooms, footsteps echoing in the dead of night, and fleeting glimpses of figures where no one stood. For over a century, the house had stood empty, abandoned to time, but not forgotten. Hannah Green knew these stories. Everyone in the nearby village did. As a writer, she found herself drawn to such places, intrigued by the macabre. The Manor, Thornwick House, had been the site of a tragedy over 100 years ago. A wealthy family, the Thornwicks, had lived there until one cold night. They simply vanished, leaving no trace, no explanation. The only thing the authorities found was the house itself, eerily silent, doors creaking on their hinges as though it had been left that way for only a moment. Hannah, seeking inspiration for her next novel, decided to rent the house for a month. It was the perfect setting for her new book, isolated, atmospheric, and filled with unsolved mysteries. The villagers had tried to dissuade her. Mrs. Carmichael, the elderly woman who ran the town's only bed and breakfast, had been especially adamant. "You can't stay there, dear," she had warned, her voice trembling with age and fear. "That house, it's cursed. People say you can hear the Thornwicks still, wandering the halls. Some even say the house doesn't want you to leave." But Hannah, ever the skeptic, had smiled politely and dismissed it as local superstition. She didn't believe in curses or ghosts. What she did believe in was atmosphere, and Thornwick House had it in abundance. She told herself that if anything, the house would inspire her creativity. The house loomed large in the fading light as she approached. Its windows were dark and lifeless, the stone exterior weathered and cracked by time. The wrought iron gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound like a groan from deep within the earth. The path leading to the front door was overgrown, weeds and ivy threatening to reclaim the once grand estate. Hannah's hand trembled slightly as she slid the heavy brass key into the lock. It was just nerves, she told herself. The stories had gotten to her more than she'd like to admit, but that would fade once she settled in. The door swung open with a reluctant groan, revealing the dark, cavernous entryway. The air inside was cold, much colder than it should have been for a late summer evening. She flipped the light switch on, illuminating the large foyer. The house was surprisingly well-maintained inside, given its age. Dusty, yes, and clearly uninhabited, but the furniture was intact, and the grand staircase rose up to the second floor like a spine of ancient wood. Hannah dropped her bags by the door and wandered through the house, feeling a thrill as she imagined the history embedded in the walls. The kitchen was quaint, with an old-fashioned stove and brass fittings. The parlor was adorned with faded portraits and worn furniture, as though it had been left exactly as it was when the Thornwicks disappeared. Upstairs, the bedrooms were similarly untouched. Hannah couldn't help but wonder if the house's preservation had something to do with the fear it inspired in the townsfolk. No one wanted to be in here long enough to disturb it as the evening wore on. She set up her writing desk in the drawing room, overlooking the vast, overgrown garden. She lit a few candles, more for ambience than necessity, and began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the house creak. But she paid it no mind that it wasn't until well past midnight that she heard it, the faintest sound, like the whisper of a voice carried on the wind. Hannah froze, her fingers hovering over the keys. She held her breath, straining to listen. For a long moment, there was nothing but the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, just as she was about to dismiss it, she heard it again. "Help me." The voice was distant, barely more than a sigh, but it was unmistakable. Hannah's heart raced as she stood up, her chair scraping the floor. She looked around the room, searching for the source, but there was no one there. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. She swallowed hard, telling herself it was just her imagination. She had been writing a ghost story after all. Her mind was playing tricks on her. But the whisper came again, this time more insistent. "Help me?" Hannah's breath caught in her throat. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere upstairs. She hesitated, every instinct telling her to leave the house, but her curiosity got the better of her. Grabbing a flashlight, she crept up the stairs, the wood creaking under her feet. The hallway was dark, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. She swung the flashlight beam across the floor, illuminating the dusty carpet and the doors to the bedrooms. The sound came again, louder now, more urgent. "Please help." It was coming from the end of the hall, behind the last door. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest as she approached. She reached for the doorknob, her hand shaking. Slowly, she turned it and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a small bedroom, unremarkable except for the fact that it was freezing. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that Hannah could see her breath in the air. She stepped inside, shining the flashlight around. The bed was made, the wardrobe closed, the windows shut tight against the wind. There was nothing unusual, nothing that could explain the voice she had heard. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A faint outline in the mirror above the dresser. A figure, barely visible, standing just behind her. Hannah gasped and spun around, but the room was empty. She shone the flashlight on the mirror, her heart racing. The reflection was blurry, distorted, but she could make out the shape of a person. A woman standing behind her, staring with hollow eyes. "Please help." The voice was right behind her now, so close that she could feel the cold breath on her neck. Hannah screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. She scrambled to pick it up, her hands shaking. When she finally managed to switch it back on, the figure in the mirror was gone. The room was empty once more. Panting, Hannah backed out of the room and slammed the door. She raced down the stairs, her mind spinning. This wasn't her imagination. There was something in this house, something real. But what did it want? And why was it asking for help? She spent the rest of the night huddled in the drawing room, too scared to sleep. The whispers didn't come again, but the house felt different now, watchful, as if it were waiting. The next morning, Hannah went into the village and visited the local library, determined to find out more about the Thornwick family. She dug through old newspaper clippings and town records until she found what she was looking for. The Thornwicks had indeed vanished one night in 1898, but there was more to the story than she had heard. It seemed that before they disappeared, strange things had been happening in the house. Servants had reported seeing figures in the mirrors, hearing voices at night. And then, just days before the family vanished, the youngest daughter, Abigail, had fallen ill. She had spoken of a woman in her room, a ghost who whispered to her, begging for help. Hannah's blood ran cold as she read the account. The description of the ghost matched the figure she had seen in the mirror. Could it be the same spirit, still trapped in the house after all these years? That night, Hannah returned to Thornwick House armed with a plan. She wasn't a medium, but she knew enough about ghost lore to try something. She lit candles in the upstairs bedroom where she had seen the figure and placed a mirror on the floor. Then, she sat down and waited. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock downstairs. Midnight came and went, and Hannah began to doubt her plan. Maybe it had all been a figment of her imagination after all. But just as she was about to give up, the air in the room grew cold. "Help me." The voice was faint at first, but it grew louder, more desperate. Hannah looked into the mirror, and there she was, the woman, her eyes hollow, her face twisted in agony. "What do you want?" Hannah whispered, her voice shaking. "Help me find peace." Hannah realized then what she had to do. The spirit was trapped, unable to move on because of the tragedy that had befallen her in life. She needed someone to acknowledge her, to understand her pain. With trembling hands, Hannah spoke to the ghost, telling her she was free, that she didn't have to stay here any longer. The room grew colder still, the candles flickering violently. For a moment, Hannah thought the house itself might crumble around her. But then, slowly, the temperature began to rise. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the figure in the mirror faded away, her expression one of relief. Hannah sat there for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence, peaceful at rest. Whatever had haunted Thornwick House for all those years was finally gone. She packed her things the next morning and left the house without looking back. The villagers were surprised to see her return so soon, but Hannah didn't tell them what had happened. Some things, she decided, were better left unsaid. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't left Thornwick House entirely behind.